All right. Today we're tackling a really big one, the story of India's colonial economy. We're going to unpack exactly what happened during those 200 years of British rule. So let's just dive right in.
And this is a massive question, right? I mean, before the British Empire, India was a true global economic powerhouse. But by the time they left, it was one of the world's poorest nations. So, what on earth happened? How did this complete rewiring take place? Well, let's trace that transformation step by step and see what the sources tell us.
Okay, so to really get a grip on this huge change, we've got to know where things started. You have to understand the before to appreciate the after. So let's take a quick snapshot of the pre-British economy, and we'll focus on what was arguably its most important asset, land.
So let's get right into this idea of ownership. Before the British showed up, it was pretty straightforward. The person who actually worked the land, the tiller, was considered the owner. Simple as that. Now, you had figures called zamindars, who we might think of as landlords, but they weren't really. Their job was just to collect revenue for the state. They didn't own the land. And this is a really crucial point. Land wasn't a commodity back then, not something you could just buy and sell on a whim. It was deeply tied to the community, governed by all these customary rights. And since there was a ton of land available, there wasn't this intense pressure on it that we see later. This system, it had been in place for centuries. But yeah, it was all about to get turned completely upside down. Which brings us to the first major shakeup. See, the British weren't just interested in collecting taxes more efficiently. Oh no, they wanted to fundamentally remake the entire idea of what it meant to own land in India. And their goal was actually pretty simple when you think about it. They wanted to establish the state, that is, them, as the supreme landlord, and they wanted to formalize private property rights. Now, why would they do that? Well, it made collecting taxes way more efficient and predictable. Plus, it created a market for land, something that could be bought, sold, and used to generate wealth and, of course, exert control. So they brought in three main systems to do this. First, you had the zamindari system. This is wild. The tax collector, the zamindar, was suddenly made the legal owner of the land. And the farmers, the tillers who'd owned it for generations, they just became tenants. Then you had the rayodwari and mahalwari systems. Here, the peasants were technically recognized as owners, but, and it's a big but, they now had to pay taxes directly to the British government. And these taxes were fixed at rates that were often just cripplingly high. No matter which system you were under, the result was the same. The ancient relationship between people and their land was broken permanently. And the fallout from this was, well, it was severe. With these insane taxes and land now being a sellable asset, countless farmers fell deep into debt. They had no choice but to borrow from mine lenders. And you can guess what happened next. They often lost their land. At the same time, any real investment in agriculture just plummeted. These new absentee landlords, they had zero incentive to improve the land. Why would they? This all led to a major drop in productivity. But, these changes weren't just happening on the farms. An even more dramatic transformation was taking place in trade and industry. This is a story of how India went from being known as the workshop of the world to something very different.
Just look at this. It shows a truly profound shift. Back in the 18th century, what was India exporting? High-value, finished goods. We're talking about those fine textiles, the muslins and calicos that were famous all over the world. Fast forward to the mid-19th century, and that picture has completely flipped. Now, the main exports are raw agricultural goods, raw cotton, indigo, opium, all being sent to feed the hungry new factories in Britain. The result of this shift it's just staggering. Think about this. In the year 1800, India's share of world trade was about 20%. By 1913, that share had absolutely collapsed to just 1.5%. That isn't just a decline. That's a seismic shift in global economic power. So this begs a really critical question, doesn't it? What happened to all of India's famous weavers, spinners, and artisans? Where did they all go? Well, the answer lies in one powerful and pretty devastating concept: deindustrialization. As Britain's own industrial revolution kicked into high gear, cheap machine-made textiles just flooded the Indian market. They completely undercut the traditional handicraft industries. Millions, literally millions of artisans lost their livelihoods. I mean, look at the numbers for textile workers alone. It fell from over 6 million in 1850 to just 2.5 million by 1913. And where could they go? They had no other option but to go back to farming, putting even more pressure on an agricultural sector that was already in crisis. This brings us to our next big theme:
And it's a controversial one. It's a theory that tries to explain exactly how India's wealth was systematically transferred to Britain. It's famously known as the drain of wealth. Now, this theory was really pioneered by early Indian nationalists, most famously Dadabhai Naoroji. And what he argued was that Britain was siphoning resources out of India, not through some kind of fair trade, but through the very structure of colonial rule itself. The system was rigged from the start. So how exactly did this drain work? Well, Naoroji pointed to a few key things. First, trade. The East India Company would use tax money that it collected in India to buy Indian goods to export. Think about that for a second. India was basically paying for its own exports. Then you had something called home charges. This meant that Indian revenues had to pay the salaries and pensions for every British official, both the ones in India and the ones back in London. On top of that, India was forced to pay for Britain's military campaigns, even ones waged completely outside its borders. And even something like the railways, which sounds like a positive, was structured so that all the profits, all the highly paid European jobs, and all the equipment contracts, they all flowed right back to Britain. And Naoroji's final estimate, it was just shocking. He calculated that this drain added up to about 8% of India's entire national income being siphoned off to Britain. Not just once, but year after year after year. So, that brings us to the end of the colonial era. Let's look at the legacy. When India finally gained its independence in 1947, what kind of economy was it left with?
Honestly, the picture in 1947 was incredibly bleak. The country was left with abysmal social indicators, literacy around 15%, life expectancy in the low 30s. It had a shattered industrial base and an agricultural sector that was in a state of permanent crisis. The economy was completely stagnant, and the savings rate was so tiny, around 3% of GDP, that investing in future growth was almost impossible. This was the starting line for a brand new independent nation.
And you can see how India's early policies were a direct response to this colonial inheritance. The new government immediately moved to abolish the zamindari system, trying to give land back to the tillers. They put new regulations in place to protect tenants. And that massive push in the 60s, the Green Revolution, was a desperate effort to finally break free from agricultural stagnation. Really, every single one of these policies was an attempt to undo a piece of the colonial economic structure they were left with. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. All those structures that were built and all the ones that were dismantled during those 200 years, they didn't just vanish in 1947. Not at all. They set the stage for so many of the challenges that post-colonial India would face. And you can still find their echoes today in patterns of land ownership, in the industrial structure, in regional inequality. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Just how long is the shadow cast by an economic empire